Hello again. It's Saturday morning and it's kind of sunny still. Yesterday was gorgeously sunny. It was an unexpected late summer day in September and we went off into Yorkshire for the afternoon and had a day visiting Todmorden and Hebden Bridge in the Calder Valley, which was gorgeous. We had a really nice lunch with our friend Siobhan, and then we went to all the bookshops and charity shops all along the way. So I do have a bit of a book haul to show you, which is kind of embarrassingly heavy. Hold on. These aren't in order. They also include some books that I got the other day in Withington, near us in Manchester. We had a short afternoon trip out. So I'll do them in order, I think, of days. To lend this a touch of spurious autobiographical authenticity. Right, in Withington there's a number of little charity shops, some of them quite random and not decrepit, they're not slick like lots of these shops are, and they have lots of older books. And some surprising things that turn up. And this is a kid's book from the 60s. It's an old library copy. Philip the Fox by D.L. Voss Bark, with illustrations by Denise Brown. These kind of, they're not woodcuts or lino cuts, they're kind of ink etchings, and they're just beautiful. It's part of this kind of natural history tales. It's a whole genre, isn't it? And it's 3 stories. One about a badger, one about a fox, and one about something else, a hare. And they just seem really gorgeously written. Overwritten to kind of our eyes now, I think. In terms of kids' books anyway. This one begins with this, for example. It's so descriptive. The October mornings with their sharp frosts were the greatest joy to Philip. Sometimes he crept home early during the night, glad to settle inside his stone shelter, or roll up and keep warm in some rabbit burrow. When he woke up in the early morning, it was into a fairy world. The frost had painted the woods silver. The red and yellow colouring on the trunks of the great firs showed faintly pink under the layer of frost, while the spiky foliage of the firs seemed as if their edges were bound with thick white lace. More than anything, the silver birch wood below seemed to come into its greatest glory. The soft rose and silver of the bark and the graceful slender branches seemed to have stepped straight out of a child's fairy tale, while in odd patches on the ground, in the soft mossy earth of the wood itself, there lived for a few vivid hours strange, gay toadstools, some with scarlet spots on their pale cream domes, others of delicate blue with black markings, and underneath they were all dressed in pale pink, accordion-pleated linings. An artist passing through those woods would have known at once that the little people had been at work here in the night, or perhaps a gay witch. It's outdated in so many ways. It's not even worth going into. I like the idea of a gay witch skipping about with the little people in the woods. It's a whole different story. A weird kind of Enid Blyton. But things like the mushrooms with their accordion pleated linings, that's so intensely beautiful and exact as a piece of description, and the colours are wonderful, but it does feel outmoded in some ways. When you look at kids' books now, they are a bit more businesslike, a bit more cursory, a bit more action-oriented, and I think that's not always a good thing. I think we need to dwell in those details, especially of nature like that. Anyway, that's a lovely find, and I remember the days when school libraries were filled with books like these. And even then, in the 80s, and 70s, this would have looked mouldy and old-fashioned to my eyes, which I kind of regret now, although I loved things about nature and animals, so maybe it wouldn't have put me off. In the back, there's a little tiny account of a kid's book about a Christmas tree by E.M. Almedigan. That sounds really nice. A Christmas story from the 60s that I might have to go and search out. Okay, also on whatever day it was, Wednesday, in Withington, I happened upon a lovely hardback of the fourth in this series, the Miss Peregrine's Peculiar Children series by Ransom Riggs. I've read the first two. I've got the third in hardback somewhere waiting for me. I couldn't pass up the opportunity to buy the fourth one to get ready. All of these things I have to add. I mean, this cost $3.99. It's a first edition hardback from whenever it was, 2018. Yeah, $3.99 is a lot for me to be spending on something like this. That's all. I'm just pointing out that I don't spend a fortune on these things. I think that's important as well. It's a hunt to find things that have slipped through the net that people don't necessarily notice. I know people spend a lot on things, that's up to them. Sometimes I do, but it's all relative, isn't it? I mean, this cost 99p, and you feel that nobody else wanted it, which is a shame. Another bargain was this. As I've said before, I've had this Batman nostalgia this year, and this compiles a number of stories about the Scarecrow, going back to the 40s. So you've got these vintage strips, which I love, the 40s, 50s and 60s ones. But the ones I really love are the ones I read when I was a kid, which are the 70s and early 80s. Before the kind of proper Dark Knight stuff came in, before Frank Miller and all those people who did wonderful things got their hands on Batman and turned him dark and edgy forever, as the films always are. I liked it when it was somewhere between the 60s day glow comic strips on the TV and Tim Burton. And I think that's somewhere in the early 1980s. And so, and usually these things are quite expensive to get hold of. This was a couple of quid in the charity shop, which I was delighted to find. I love the idea of it going trans-historically through Batman. The colours are so wonderful. Anyway, that's a bit of Batman. Right, and then yesterday we went to, as I said, Hebden Bridge in Todmorden, and one of the first things I found, and Jeremy made me buy this, in a really shabby shop, it has to be said, that didn't have much of interest, but for £1, they had this new writing for, I've talked about this before, it came out in 1995, edited by A.S. Byatt and Alan Hollinghurst, from Vintage in association with the British Council. This is an old library copy, huge fat volume of poetry, essays, and stories, and people like, the list is on the back, Brian Aldiss, Louis de Bernier, Helen Dunmore, Tibor Fisher, Alistair Gray, Hanif Qureshi, Peter Porter, Muriel Spark, William Trevor, Faye Weldon, and me. It was my first ever publication, my first published short story, the first time somebody paid me for a piece of writing, in 1994 when it sold. And it came out in 95, and it was a big deal. I've got one copy of this left, of my own, and Jeremy forced me to buy this as a spare, which was really sweet. Sweet that he cared. Very kind of happy memories of all of this and the attention my story got at the time. And, 30 years ago, when the letter asking if they could buy it for the book was at the bottom of this huge heap of letters when I went back to my mum's house. And if I hadn't picked it up at that point, I would never have sold the story. That would be it. I would have had to do something else to start off on this crazy career. But, you know, sometimes serendipity works. The converse of that is when I moved out of a flat in Edinburgh after my first book came out. And then when I gave a reading in Edinburgh 6 months after that, a year after that, the new inhabitants of that flat turned up with a huge bag load of my post. Huge bag, which we then emptied out in the Blue Moon Cafe very late at night afterwards to see what post I'd missed. They'd never forwarded stuff. And there were quite a few things in there that I would have liked to have picked up on at the time. I can't even remember now, but there were kind of things that would have been good. Again, serendipity, things work out. You do your best, but things work out the way they do. Okay, other things. This was more Todmorden, a hardback copy of this, which I've read and loved. I read it during lockdown, Geekarella, a novel by Ashley Poston. And this is the one about the invented science fiction show, which I came to believe in completely. There's a trilogy of novels about the fandom of this show, and this was the first, and it's a romance set during a big science fiction convention. Of the three, it's by far the best. I've really enjoyed the Ashley Poston books I've read. She's gone into out and out romance now, mainstream adult romance, moving away from her young adult, slightly more geeky stuff. But I enjoy her work, and I'm delighted to have a perfect bound hardback to go on my favourites shelf. In some ways, that's the most satisfying book shopping of all. Books you've already bought, books you've already read, and you've got a nice copy of. There's no stress on, I must get to that. You already have. And in fact, somebody says that in something I read recently. Oh, Helene Hanff, the repository of all knowledge about books, of sense. And she said that libraries are for books you haven't read, when you're still testing them out and seeing what you like. And bookshops are for buying books that you've already read, books you know you want to own and have in your home. And there's a great good sense about that, and I wish I could stick to it. Right, here's Zadie Smith. I haven't read her for a long time. I read her first book when it came out in 2001, I remember, and I haven't read much since. This is a 2019 collection of short stories in hardback that seemed certainly worth it for £1.50, but especially worth it because I have read the story called Escape from New York, which was in the New Yorker at some point in the last 10 years, maybe even 10 years ago. It's a story that I really loved. It's about the day of 9/11 and a escape attempt, a fictionalized, hopefully fictionalized, thing in which Michael Jackson, Liz Taylor and Marlon Brando get in the car and try to escape from Manhattan Island, knowing that all hell is breaking loose. They don't know what's going to happen next after the bombing of the World Trade Center. I think, in my memory, it's about their absolute idiocy as celebrities, that anything that happens in the world is all about them. It's a very satirical, very sweet and touching story. So I'm glad to have a copy of that. What else? Then we went to, the nice bookshop in Todmorden. There's a lovely, properly vintage bookstore where things are stacked to the ceiling and crammed in. It's quite hard to get around. And the science fiction is on the turning of the stairs. So you've got to sit on the staircase to look at them. And suddenly there was all these Star Trek books. And as you know, as I've said before, my guilty pleasure is Star Trek fiction. Not guilty pleasure, it's just pleasure, as I always say. And actually there was a table outside of things for £1, and they actually had a copy of one of these, really nicely kept. This is from 1972. It's one of the original Severin House hardbacks of the James Blish adaptations. It was a series that went from 1 to 12, and I read them in these really gorgeous editions with a picture of a toy Enterprise on the front, I think. And I read them in 84, 85, and then they started coming out in corgi paperbacks with lovely Chris Archilios covers. But I read them here first in these very comfy hardbacks. You rarely see them. I've got one from years ago, and then to find this for £1 is magic. And what's also magic is the note at the back, on the back page. I don't know if you can see that, but it made me laugh. Die. I couldn't stay awake any longer. Missed me nookie again. Ha ha. Love you, Kev. Which weirdly sounds like the kind of note that Kirk would leave one of his alien green-skinned lovers. The only thing I can see wrong with this is somebody has torn this page. But nevertheless, it's absolute treasure. And the other Star Trek thing I picked up in this plethora of Star Trek things is volume 1 of this, the Alan Dean Foster collection of logs, Star Trek logs, that went from 1 to 10. That was the follow-up to the Blish things. They were the adaptations of the animated series, which Alan Dean Foster did with great aplomb. And on my shelves, I've got 2 through to 6. In a horrible edition, actually, that somebody did in the early or late 90s. This edition's not that nice. Corgi in the 70s not doing a very good job, I don't think, with tiny print going right up to the edges. But you can't complain. It's a really fantastic series. And at some point, someday, they'll do a really nice set, I hope. And not some dreadful omnibus, where they chuck them all in one. I'd like lovely hardbacks with lovely illustrations, treating them as stories in a book and not something that's just for, it's not just memorabilia of a TV show. They are stories in their own right, especially when you get people like Blish and Alan Dean Foster writing them. Okay, then in Hebden Bridge itself, the flea market was on, and I shouldn't be showing this because it's going to be a present. This is a Purnell book from 1981, and this is a dinosaur pop-up book, and it's going to be for my niece, who, like her mother, like my sister, is obsessed with dinosaurs. I've got my dinosaur t-shirt on, actually. This is from a time when kids' books were, I just think, really inventive and really lovely. And, even the educational ones had really funny, quirky things about them. I love paper engineering and pop-up books. I've never been involved in making one. Maybe I should. You have to be careful with them, though, not too heavy-handed. Oh, I'll open this on camera. The pterodactyl page. They even make creaky noises. Look at that. It's like it's flying out of the book. A friend of mine did a book of Greek myths years ago that was all paper engineered. I should look for a copy of that. In fact, I don't know why I've not got a copy of that. Look, a biting ichthyosaur and a indignant brachiosaur or brontosaurus or plesiosaur maybe. I think it's a plesiosaur. It's got flippers. Yeah, the flippers. Plesiosaurus. And oh. I'm not sure I'm opening that. Oh, look, leather. Yeah, this is a page to stand upright rather than spring out. I'm going to go through the whole book, aren't I? I'm sure it's quite rudimentary by the standards of pop-up books today. I don't know. I'm sure they've become very sophisticated. But I think this is fun. There's a little dial there to go through the years. Anyway. other pop-up books in this series, The Three Little Pigs and The Wizard of Oz. I might have to look for them too. So that was a present. And then I've read about Claire Keegan or seen people doing stuff on here about her, and she sounds like a really interesting writer. It's a collection of short stories. And then Olga Tokarzuk, I don't know, Flights, from Fitzcarraldo Press. Now I've read Fitzcarraldo Press. I've been reading a long article in the New Yorker about this small press, who do mostly books in translation, and do them really stylishly, and they're slightly challenging literary fiction and non-fiction, and they've won umpteen awards, and authors have gone on and done, won the Nobel Prize, so they're always well chosen. It's a really interesting story about the press itself and its 10 years of publishing these 100 books. And so I was determined to read this one, because this was the one they talked about, where somebody, a translator, had sent 100 pages to the publisher, and it sat on his desk for a year, and then he read it and brought this out, and then she won the Nobel Prize, which is an amazing story. And it sounds loopy. Flights is a novel about travel in the 21st century and human anatomy, broaching life, death, motion, and migration. From the 17th century, we have the story of the Dutch anatomist Philip Verheyen, who dissected and drew pictures of his own amputated leg. From the 18th century, we have the story of the North African-born slave turned Austrian courtier, stuffed and put on display after his death. In the 19th century, we follow Chopin's heart as it makes its covert journey from Paris to Warsaw. In the present, we have the harrowing story of a young husband whose wife and child mysteriously vanish on a holiday on a Croatian island. With her signature grace and insight, blah, 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 blurb stuff, guides the reader beyond the surface layer of modernity. What's funny is they have stuff about the other books that they publish in the back. Most of them mention W.G. Sebald. He's become the kind of high water mark of high European modernism, which is great, but very funny. And that mixing of lots of different non-fiction subjects into a kind of meandering narrative of a kind of first person wandering through a landscape is very Sebald, isn't it? I got it from the Hebden Bridge bookcase, I think it's called, their indie bookshop. And again, I have this thing. Everyone loves indie bookshops. I kind of don't. I don't know why. I wish they'd just play music and not make you feel as if you were stepping into their private sitting room. It was just before closing, so maybe they were keen to get closed and get finished. But I really felt like, I felt obliged to just buy something and leave our shop, please. And it wasn't helped by, they had a window display featuring somebody awful. They'd made a big fuss about somebody really not very pleasant, who I know. I'm not going to say more than that. They also had a book by somebody I really like, so that balanced it. But I didn't feel particularly welcomed in the shop, which is, you don't want, you just want things to be comfy and like you can kind of browse comfortably. I felt that, again, as I've said before, in a couple of other indie bookshops in the area. And I don't know why. Maybe it's just me. Maybe I'm weird. I feel comfier in shops that are kind of a bit filled with tatty old stuff. Maybe that is just me. Anyway, I came away with Flights, and it just looks really nice and stylish. And the last book of the day, this is an awful lot of books in one day. I came home and there was an eBay parcel waiting, and as you know, I've been reading still, halfway through James Lovegrove's Doctor Strange, and this is one of his Sherlock books, a Christmassy Sherlock book about demons and stuff, that as soon as I saw it existed, I had to go and get myself a copy. One of Titan's Sherlock Holmes books. They publish a bunch of people I know actually doing Sherlock books. My friend Stuart Douglas has done about 5, and a couple of other friends have done them too. And I want to read the Sherlock Holmes and Cthulhu stories. Jeremy laughed out loud when he found out there were such things. I love that. I love team-ups. Right, that's everything. I've gone on too long. That's my pile of stuff. I think we're going out again today. Jeremy's keen on record shopping, and there's a sale somewhere that he needs to go to. Yes, so that's it. Goodbye, and I'll see you again quite soon in the next video. I shouldn't say that. That's somebody else's catchphrase on one of these. The next episode, the next thing. See you again. Goodbye.